Hi guys, I'm Timo of Leap Magazine and you're watching Season Pass, a show that takes you behind the curtains of the eSport industry. Today's panelists are Sovann, Skim, Kim, the former head of Dota at GoSuGamers, Lawrence Malystryx Phillips, the editor-in-chief at JoinDOTA, and Johan Järvinen, former reporter for OnGamers. Welcome, gentlemen. I'm thinking that, gatekeepers is going to be our first topic today. And your stance and experiences with this. To get the ball rolling, how do you perceive the gatekeeping aspect of sports journalism? How do you perceive the thing that, you have these channels, these established outlets that pretty much these days do their own thing. They have their own journalism, they have their own aspects. And as a journalist, where before it was your job to tell people what's going on, do you feel you still have the same access? Do you feel it's gotten better? Do you feel it's gotten worse? Do you feel it's just something different? What's your take on gatekeeping in general?
I definitely think it's gotten better over the years, just as the scene has matured. Especially in Dota, I think a lot of people have matured into becoming a bit more professional. But overall, it's still a bit clunky, to put it mildly, because a lot of people you can definitely still feel that a lot of players feel like they have a lot of power over what they can say, what they can do, and what they can't do. So a lot of times you actually get denied interviews just really easily, just because the pro player just doesn't feel like it right now.
I would say it gets harder. I think every time a new game comes out, you have to reset. So you need to learn the new players. Some players are very selective with who they give interviews to. In an ideal world, you're a journalist, you want to interview a team, you should have access to everybody, but it's not really like that. You do have to know the right people. And for example, I took a break from esports. All the people I know are gone. I need to learn all the people again, and it's like a fresh start. So I think for a journalist, that's difficult if the game keeps changing. When you've got one game and it's stable, that's fine. But I've done lots of different games, and it is quite difficult to sort of stay in the game. So there is some level of favoritism. You've got to know the right people, but it is better than it was 10 years ago.
For me, getting into Dota, when I started, came in with Dota 2, it was a lot of the Wild West still. There wasn't that much control from the side of the teams. So you'd sort of you'd talk to players and you'd form these bonds with players, and you'd get interviews based on that. Now you have to sort of work with the organizations a lot more, and that can help you sometimes, because the organizations also want the players to do interviews. So if you don't have that great bond, you can sort of go through the organization. They sort of want you to get their brand out there sometimes. But at other times, it makes it a lot more complicated to actually, you can't just go up to a guy that you know and go, hey, let's sit down, let's talk. So.
Well, that's kind of an interesting aspect, because obviously what you're touching upon there is the power of the gatekeepers now is pretty much to turn any content into PR.
I think it depends on the organization as well. So, for example, Alliance is a company or a team very aware that PR is important, but other teams are not so much. I think it's based on the organization as well, their sponsors, what's the relationship with the sponsors. For example, Monster, they sponsor Alliance and EG, they always mention it, but other teams, they don't see the point. They just want to play games like maybe the Russian teams, for example. They don't think, interviews are really necessary, they just play the game. So I think it's based on the organization, perhaps, more than, I said about the game, but yeah, organization does play a role. Okay, but do you what's your take on the fact that theoretically, you will find, like you said as well, and you said you've got to kind of know people, you've got to build these relations to them, and once you do, if you're too critical, if you say something in these regards, that might hurt your chances of getting interviews in the future. Do you find that this somehow prevents you? Obviously, it will, if that's the case, prevent you from doing your job. But do you find that that's something that can be avoided? If we look at traditional sports, for instance, most of these players are contractually obliged to at least interact with the press in one way or the other. Whereas esports in general, if we look at the whole scene, cross games and everything, we're not quite there. Is that a good thing? Is that a good thing that we don't necessarily force the people into these, advertising stints? But at the same time, does it, it kind of closes things. So what's your take on the pros and cons of that?
I think there's a big upside to not having these obligations just yet, just because I feel like I've noticed that when there's a lot of players that if you force them into something, and force them into interviews, that the quality of the interviews also suffer, because you can just generally tell that they're really not comfortable with this sort of stuff. And a lot of these players are still very young. They're still young adults that just still need to mature. So I can definitely see that there's still an upside to not forcing anything, just because you need to still give them their space. But at the same time, of course, it does prevent a lot of stuff. I mean, Sanzu has mentioned that, yeah, sure, now that we can go to the organizations, but there's also politics that prevent certain scenarios from happening. Because let's say you're writing for, say, the Red Bull, you can't just interview somebody that's sponsored by Monster, because obviously that would sort of get in the way of different sort of like sponsorships and stuff. So there's definitely still issues there that need to be worked out.
Yeah, and like, I don't generally pull my punches in interviews. I try to get at what I'm interested in. Yeah, like, you do sometimes run into situations where people from like the PR wing come and tell you, well, there's some things here, like, could you change the wording a bit? And yeah. It's not always easy, and you'd like to sort of get at the actual truth, but there is also this sort of feeling that a lot of people are trying to protect themselves. They don't want to say anything too controversial. And perhaps more than just the interviews, you see this in like the sort of the company line when it comes to, for example, why a certain player left the team or something like that. Yeah. You always get the story. And the story is never the one that you actually know is true.
But do you find at the same time, though, I mean, obviously, that's also, the gatekeeping also serves a dual purpose. Because at the same time, I mean, on one hand, they are damage control. You know, they are making sure that only PR-approved things get out. But on the other hand, we do see a tendency within the press, if we're all honest sometimes, that can be a bit exploitive. So if you have someone leaving a team, what's the important angle here? Is it that they left the team because of drama, or is it the effect on the team? So obviously, I mean, do you feel that the gatekeeping is justified in that case when it kind of protects the brand of the team, the coherency, and the rest of the team players?
Well, if we look outside of esports, I mean, say for example in football, I feel like there's just the press and, let's say, the organization, it feels like they're two equal powers that just, I mean, everybody obviously wants the best for themselves, but at the same time, since they're so equally strong, they can just do whatever, and like everybody still knows what they're doing and knows the scheme of things. Whereas in esports, it feels like the organization has the power over the guys, over the press, so, or most of the times anyway. So in certain aspects, sometimes, yeah, when somebody leaves a team, actually it sometimes even feels like, depending on the organization, that the press can't just get the full scoop on things just because of the pressure that the organization might apply. I personally feel like there's only a few people in esports that actually have the power. Say Richard Lewis, for example, that can just go out and leak stuff, for example, leak a scoop, leak a story. But there's other people in the scene, in this industry, that don't have this power. That if they do this kind of stuff, they lose their relations to certain people.
I think you need a certain type of skill set to be kind of Richard Lewis kind of journalist. And in terms of like, in the past, like maybe 5 or 10 years ago, players were important, commentators weren't. Now we see a shift towards commentators are equally famous or influential as players. So I think in the future, even the next step would be press are as influential. When I was writing about Warcraft 3, there was a player called Grubby, and he refused to do an interview with me because I wrote something about him that he didn't like. So there are certain players who obviously will be annoyed, and sometimes there are some players that don't actually have anything to say anyway. And even in football, if you interview a player, you've always got the one press guy, like Rooney, oh yeah, I've played a really good game, I just tried my best, we did the best for the team, yeah. And that's what happens. So I don't think you really need access to everyone. Not everyone has something interesting to say. And in terms of like team, news, it is nice to have a bit of drama. But you've got extremes normally in esports. One is like, oh yes, it's like, when music groups break up, what do they say? Artistic differences, right? We don't. Oh, we broke up because it didn't work. And the other extreme is like, oh yeah, he's a beep, he's a blank. And so I think it is difficult in the sense that gatekeeping is very dependent on the players. and the attitude of the players. And I think it's okay to have drama as long as that's what really happens. Like for me, I don't like, if it doesn't matter the topic, as long as it really happened, that's what happened. Why not know the truth? You know, why not? You know, so players care about images, teams care about images, but I think the truth is what most people want to know. And Richard Lewis is famous because he exposes the truth. He's not making up rubbish. He's found something that happens, and then people like that. They want to hear the truth. So I think that's where the decision lies. It has to be about the truth, and then everything's fine.
Well, with that, I do believe that we're going to wrap up for this episode. So for more on the esports scene and for more episodes of Season Pass, stay tuned to LeapMat.com. Thank you, gentlemen.